Across Khandar hills, one summer's morn, to join rival clans rode I. Pennants proudly high rode Khandarog's skies, called to war in days gone by. 'Twas better to die 'neath Khandarog's skies than in Khalquayam meek and tame. Their weakest fell, and Khandarog's Star-Litten bell told number and legend and name. As lesser folk gazed, jealous hearts ablaze, at our fearless daughters but few, she who led the fight spoke Khandarog's rights and raised sorceries anew. She pledged struggle and strength, implored sisters at length that Khalquayam not forgotten lie. Her valor fled those inglorious dead when they failed 'neath Khandarog's eye. An excerpt from the traditional Khandari epic, The Fall of Khalquayam. Author unknown. Star-Litten steel. Amber as liquor and rippling like an inland sea, the wind-swept grass astride the rolling hills of the Khandari savannah has swallowed up many unwary wanderers in its uncountable march of years. Gnarled acacia trees and towering cacti thrust up here and there from the living carpet, but water is a scarce commodity indeed. More often than not, a day's ride separates one shallow, stagnant pond from another, unless one rides the crocodile-haunted banks of the Poco River as it winds its languid way through the heartland. Muddy sinkholes are all a traveler can count on. A wanderer is not the only beast which thirsts on the sunburnt plains of Khandar, however. Everything from the wayward antelope to the prowling lioness might chance the tepid water to stave off the heat. Elephant stomping grounds are never far from their favored seasonal watering holes, and woe betide the stranger that encroaches upon the territory of the gigantic elephants of Khandar. Vipers lurk in the shade of grass which sprawls green on the muddy shore, and vultures large enough to pluck a child from the saddle circle overhead in search of easy meals. Many, then, might be tempted to bring along great caravans of stores and provisions. After all, one unfamiliar with the terrain would be hard-pressed enough to even find these pools, much less survive the process of getting a drink. Still, the open plain has more than enough surprises in store, however far one might stray from the water. Mighty scorpions, large as highland cattle, prowl the scattered outcrops of rock upon the grassland, and beasts too weak to jostle for position near the pools scrounge what they can in the wastes, desperate for another morsel to carry them through to the next day. The amber ocean hides threats until they are almost upon you, and the moan of the Khandar wind through the brittle grass leaves you deaf to the soft tread of stalking paws. There is, though, one thing the unfamiliar wanderer in Khandar fears more than wild beasts and the brutal light of day. When the sun sinks low in the endless skies, and the moon crests the horizon on the savannah, all the world seems to fall silent and still. Few creatures larger than locusts rustle the grass, and the inland ocean becomes almost aquatic, tinted blue by the night. The screaming wind seems the sole living force in a dead and stifled landscape. Only a fool would try to light a fire in a sheltered crag amidst the shallow hills and stave off the chill. Such things draw hungry eyes. The wise lay low and await the dawn. Should the foreigners prove unlucky, they will hear it just after the last rays of the sun are lost. A nervous, frenzied cackling rises up beyond the horizon, echoing miles over hill and plain, underscored by that ever-yowling eastward wind. More voices take up the call, often opposite the first, their sinister laughter carrying its own cadence and forms. This is not call and response, but challenge and answer. It was just such a noise which reached Yaotl's ears in the dark, making her heart skip a beat. She had known they were coming, but that did nothing to dull the primal fear that the sounds dredged up in her soul. Long millennia of nocturnal raids and bloody pillage had taught the people of Sholo-Shaidi to fear that sound. Her angular canine features drew back in a soundless snarl, and her pointed ears swiveled to better pinpoint the distant hunters, but she did her best to seem solid as steel. That proved quite a task, even with 6 armed Ektal horsemen alongside her and a short-barreled cavalry rifle slung over her shoulder. She felt childish on the savannah. After arduous years of training, she theoretically had the know-how to navigate any situation the wastes could throw her way. It was one thing to study the Khandari, and quite another to meet them. The sleekly uniformed horseman to her right motioned in the dark, ready to send up the signal. Yaotl drew in a breath she hoped was not registered by the nervous men in her retinue, and nodded. The flare's crack sounded apocalyptic in the open space of the grassland, and the red glow which followed was almost painful. The cacophony of yipping laughter swelled. The low whine of a horn blared in the distance, and, though none among the Sholo-Shaitians could see, they knew to a man that the locals were coming. For nearly 10 excruciating minutes, the jabbering and howling grew nearer on all sides, fading for a moment now and then only to rear up again, always closer to the hushed foreigners. Hooves, paws, and less savory limbs clattered over rock and crunched through grass in the dark, the unseen fauna of the grasslands desperately attempting a final escape from the death which closed in around them. A lean, tawny lynx darted out into the open amidst the Sholo-Shaitians' horses for a hectic moment, made fearless of the strangers by the noose which drew taut around them. It disappeared into the grass across the way, only to re-emerge panicked seconds later when wet, guttural laughter sounded not far ahead, sending it scampering towards a pathetically sparse outcrop of cacti where it holed up to hide. "Lanterns," Yaotl ordered, her voice hard despite her racing heart. Electric lanterns hanging from the saddles of her gathered riders were flicked on, throwing the surrounding panoply of trampled grass and spindly undergrowth into a milky, pale light. There was a noise from the brush, more a hiss than a growl, which rolled like organic thunder from a toothy maw none of them could see. Their horses were set to whinnying and stomping, their riders tugging at the reins in an attempt to keep them from rearing up to bolt. The fact that none of the Sholo-Shaitians could see the animal in the grass left their minds to fill in the blanks, and that made the situation all the more frigid. "We tasted your stink on the wind long before moonrise, little dogs." The voice was deep, and it flowed with such vicious tension that Yaotl couldn't help but visualize warm blood dripping from the jagged maw of the speaker. "What dregs come from Shaiti to traipse our savannah?" "You are subjects of the Tlatoani of the Sholo-Shaitian Empire," Yaotl said, her stony amber gaze swiveling to face the rustling grass behind which the speaker lurked. "You would do well to remember your place, savage. I speak with his voice." Yaotl's grasp of the Khandari language was vast, considering the language's brutal complexity. This was the very first time she'd used it outside the predictable confines of the Kalmakak academies. She raised a silent prayer to Khalquayam that it had been suitably intimidating. The towering blades of grass crunched and parted. A dark, brutal head emerged into the light, nearly twice the size of a horse's. It was hyena-like, but far larger than any hyena on the savannah, and far sturdier. It slunk into the light on stocky legs built for endurance, drooling and gnawing at the air as it eyed the elegant horses that opposed it. Where the Sholoshaitian foreigners rode a poised, hairless strain of slate-gray stallions bred in their own image, the massive hyena thing was all but wild. Had it not been for the serrated harness that bore its reins, it would have tore into them with the fury of a starving cannibal. As it was, its rider held it back, grinning down from the rough-hewn saddle at her unwanted guests. She was tall even for a Khandari, a fact which wasn't hard to see even with the massive Niena upon which she rode pacing back and forth beneath her. Where her visitors were cultivated and canine, she looked as ragged and hyena-like as the Niena. Her muzzle had been twisted and scarred by a lifetime of struggle. Wide golden eyes seemed to burn amidst dark fur and gnarled old scar tissue, giving her the aura of a maniac. Yellowed teeth gleamed in the lantern light beneath a mane of filthy black hair which had never seen a bathhouse save for the seasonal Khandari rains. The stained teeth were not, thank Khalquayam, bloody. For a moment, something close to a scowl pulled taut the Khandari's mangled features. The glinting eyes brightened, and a yipping, ear-splitting cackle rocked the warrior back in the saddle. Her battered armor, a cobbled patchwork of leather and dyed bone, clattered beneath a brace of aged pistols, the whole panoply shuddering as she laughed. All around them in the grass, other voices mimed the vocalization, howling laughter creeping like a contagion through the unseen ranks of the Khandari who circled them. Even their Niena mounts added their grumbling bass to the chorus. "Bold words," the Khandari said through an unsettling smile. "I like you. Fear does not dull your pride." The Khandari swept a wide arc with her long, broad-tipped assegai spear, gesturing to each of Yaotl's riders in turn. The smile disappeared as she added, "These I'm not so sure. I was under the impression your empress would send no more Raogo to treat with my people." Raogo. It was a derogatory word the Khandari assigned the males of their species, synonymous with expendable. The word empress raised qualms as well. Yaotl had to think a moment before voicing her answer, seeking to diffuse the Khandari's assertion without seeming meek in the process. "Her Majesty has passed into Khalquayam's realm," Yaotl replied. "The Tlatoani's throne is now held by her son, Ichtak VI, savior of Kushkotlan. Even so, his mother's promise to her subjects in Kandar still stands. I am the representative of the crown. These are my retinue. They are not here to treat with your people. I am." Yaotl produced a scroll from an engraved leather case affixed to the saddle, holding it up for a counterpart to see. The Khandari had no written language save foreign approximations, and the warrior across from her was almost certainly illiterate, but the single, bold Triskelion glyph set within a stylized hexagon emblazoned there didn't need to be read to be understood. The sigil of the House of Tepekishko, symbol of the Empire's Tlatoani. I speak with his authority. The weight of those heavy words after the sight of Sholoshaiti's royal seal seemed to steal a bit of the bristle from the Khandari barbarian before her. Yaotl pressed the advantage. "I trust you speak for Clan Tallata?" The Khandari drew up to her full, imposing height in the saddle, assegai held high, saying, "I am Boag Yanande. 9 seasons have I led the Tallata across the savannah." Yanande's kindred had drawn close through the foliage now. They circled and watched with hungry interest, little more than silhouettes in the gloom. Yaotl kept from looking at them, keeping her gaze locked with the Boag, the chieftain. I am Yaotl of the Ektal. Yanande laughed. Has the Empire allowed its females to join the Ektal, then? No, it has not. I serve merely as auxiliary. Only the legions have the authority to treat with foreigners. The Khandari insist on treating with women, hence here I am. An exception, not the rule. Yanande snorted. When Yaotl's stony glare failed to bend before her mockery, Yanande changed tact. Why does His Majesty call, then? What need has mighty Sholosh'aiti for the poor dregs of Yanande? War, Yaotl answered. What else? Yanande's scarred nose scrunched up. With who? The Lautani. Yanande's eyes went wide without jest or exaggeration for the first time that night. She blew a low, growling whistle, shaking her head, the bones and gold trinkets in her hair clattering with the motion. The sea people are in league with nearly all the world, Yanande muttered. You might as well say you fight all nations and all flags, little dog. We have done so before, Yaotl countered. And won, Yanande agreed with a nod. This I know. The Khandari went to growling and barking amongst themselves, with Yanande falling into accents so thick and fast Yaotl could only guess what was being yammered about in the flickering light. Eventually, the Boag halted her clan's clamor, turned back to Yaotl, and grinned. Yanande will ride for Khandaragom for the contest, then. It has been some years since a Boag Bala was chosen. Good, Yaotl nodded, doing her best to shore up her words with the unyielding reputation of the empire they represented. The Tlatoani shall await word from your people once the war chief has been named. Not just yet, though, Yanande protested, grin widening. Clan Tallata has scores to settle. Yaotl actually snorted. Like what? Skinning field mice? We've a war to fight. You have a war to fight, and we have a war to finish, little dog, Yanande cackled. Yaotl took in a heavy breath to protest, but Yanande held aloft a gauntleted hand, urging silence. My sister challenged my station as Boag 2 nights ago. I won, as always. I am no tyrant, so I merely took her Raogo as spoils and kicked her to the edge of camp. She chanted long into the night, though, and when suspicious clan sisters went to investigate her tent, my sister fled into the grass. She left something behind. Yanande reached into the folds of her plated leather armor, rummaging for a moment, and then emerged with a small totem of twisted hair and bundled sticks. This is what we found, Yanande announced, holding the vaguely Khandari-shaped effigy up for all to see. Witchery, you understand. She sought to cull me by cunning when strength seemed lacking. Yanande stuffed the effigy back into her armor, then flung wide her assegai, pointing to the western horizon. I will not be so merciful this time. The ruins of Khalquayam stand just beyond the hills, and that is the only place she could go. No doubt she thinks its wicked reputation will blunt my pursuit, but she is wrong. Only when I drag her head from Khalquayam will I ride to help with your war. The Tlatoani's call is not a request, Yaotl said, eyes narrowed. Well, it is good my riders outnumber your Raogo 4-1, then, Yanande laughed. Worry not. You can accompany us. We will be on the way to the contest come dawn if we hurry, little dog. Yaotl's gaze found the point upon the horizon for which Yanande had pointed, where the low rolling hills broke against the rich navy of the night sky. She was no native of the grassland. She needed only smell the teeming horde of toothy raiders which padded through the brush about them to be reminded of that. Even so, she knew the ruin brooding just out of sight was not a place any sane soul would dare trespass. A keen chill rippled down her spine like water. It had little to do with the wailing whine of the eternal Khandar wind. Make your errand quick, Yaotl ordered. steeling herself to meet the Boag's wild eyes. The world burns beyond the borders of your backwater, and it can spare precious little time for your games. Khalquayam. When its streets had bustled with life and its artistry had been envied as the cultural zenith of the sprawling savannah, that name evoked wealth, splendor, and comfort. The fabled jewel of Khandar, a learned oasis upon the barbarous plains. The sedentary Khandari of Khalquayam once lorded by treaty and trade over the Boags of the open grassland, and the wandering tribes had willingly traded many into slavery and servitude in return for the fruits of urban life. The master-crafted metals and silks of the city had been prized by the hard-living warriors of the saddle, and for such comforts they had, in days of old, paid tribute to Khalquayam. But such comfort was a spiteful opium, and the Boags knew it. It was one thing to wear a silken shawl beneath the hot sun, and quite another to dwell amongst the towers of Khalquayam farming the silk. By learning and cooked food in gilded homes of stone, the Khandari of Khalquayam were tamed, and became alien and soft to their kin who rode the ocean of windswept grass beyond their walls. Resentment had been built in the hearts of the nomads, fanned partly by jealousy, but mostly by disgust, until, in ancient days, they had risen in wrath against their effete urban masters. Legendary disagrees on what sparked the siege, whether it be broken treaty or diplomatic insult. Whatever started the fire, it was the Boag Bala of that distant age who doused it. She'd slaughtered the captive merchants of Khalquayam like sheep beneath the glow of a full moon in sacrifice, and brought the chanting witch priests of the gathered tribes to bear against the huddled masses within. Their sorceries had swept the impenetrable defenses of Khalquayam with curses so foul the tribes who had fought beneath the Boag Bala's banner forbade their daughters from ever again setting foot in that blasted city. The jewel of Khandar slipped into shadow, and for long millennia its ruins had stewed in darkness. When Yaotl followed Yanande's riders over the crest of a sharp hill, and the horizon was broken by Khalquayam's jagged outline against the star-spangled heavens, her heart sank. Even the silhouette of the place was foreboding, and where once its windows, balconies, and soaring spires must have bustled with flickering firelight, they now hosted only the gloom of the waiting grave. Yaotl shuddered, and found she was not alone in the gesture. Indeed, even the stony Khandari warriors felt a reflexive chill upon seeing the place. It was only proud Yanande who rode onward with head held high, spear aloft and eyes glinting in the glow of the moon, leaving the others to plod uncertain in her wake. It was a strange structure, for Khalquayam was entirely interconnected. Its legendary avenues, temples, and housing had been carved into the red stone of a mighty swathe of needle-like mountains, which thrust up from the rolling Khandar hills like bloody fangs. These conical rock formations were eaten through by hand-carved tunnels, canyons, and cathedral-ceilinged caverns into which the manors and storefronts of Khalquayam had been set. The long-dead sedentary Khandari had been master stonemasons, their ancient and noble craft rivaled only by Yaotl's people. Thus, the Sholushaishan was doubly troubled by the ruins' haunting emptiness. Reflected in that shadowy manse of still and dusty stone halls was her birthplace in distant Tepeklan, whose bustling cobble streets, angular bas-reliefs, and cyclopean tomb temples were the envy of the world. She could not help but imagine her own mighty people reduced to cloudy memory, their great cities long forgotten and left to molder in the highland sun back home. They rode on in silence, the snorting of Niena and horse growing more shrill and wavering with each mile they closed on Khalquayam. It was not long before Yanande halted, gauntleted fist raised, steely eyes wheeling round to meet the rest of the company. "The rest of you will wait here," the Boag growled. "I need no help to hunt a cornered rat. I smell the fear on you all. You would only slow me down." As Yaotl translated for her Ektal escort, she could see the relief wash over them. Even if they were less learned in the lore of Khandar than she, their ears stood on end with the thrill of a fear they didn't need history to perceive. The rotten husk before them was not to be trifled with, and though it had lain dead for an age, it exuded the malice of a slumbering titan, a titan which none of their number wished to rouse from sleep. "I will need only one witness to the deed, that my rank remain unchallenged," Yanande added. Yaotl did not like that the chieftain's eyes were locked with hers. For long, awkward seconds she glanced to the other Khandari, expecting one among their ranks to sidle forward and volunteer for the job, but they were even more unsettled than her own men, and seemed to hang low in their saddles as if the brutal Yanande might forget they were there. They needn't have worried, however, for Yaotl's worst fears were realized when the Boag finally spoke. "The foreign one will do," she said. "You are not afraid of ghosts, yes?" Yaotl, becoming accustomed to the process, dispelled her sinking stomach with all the bluster offered to her by her office and empire. "I am the voice of Shulasha'idi in Khandar," Yaotl answered, unable to keep her eyes from straying to the shadow of Khalquayam as she spoke. "I will go where I am needed. If bringing you to heal demands a trip to the ruin, then so be it." "That does not answer the question," Yanande chuckled. She did not press the issue, however. Rather, she spun her Niena around and went trotting off toward her goal once more, leaving Yaotl to spur her spooked horse along the Boag's trail. She nodded her leave to her Ektal guardsmen, and slowly faded from their view into the shifting grass. Yaotl did not have the patience, or frankly the nerve, to berate the Khandari for the disrespect she'd been shown. Whether Yanande had called her forth as a way to intimidate her or had truly believed Yaotl to be the least frightened of their number in the face of Khalquayam's menacing reputation was anyone's guess, for the Boag's keen visage was cruel as often as it was mocking. It was impossible to discern what was genuine and what was joke, and Yaotl had more pressing matters to concern herself with. Each moment they spent riding towards the ruins was one in which she could shore herself up for the great unknown which awaited her within. She had precious little time to waste fretting over pride. There was a mournful keening on the air that night. For a long while, as Yanande led on in silence, Yaotl believed it to be the billowing of the Khandar winds through the crags and halls of looming Khalquayam ahead. But as they descended soft slopes and came into the shallow valley at the foot of the mountains which housed that elder city, the grass fell still, and the breeze died away, its howl lost to her ears. Still that dreadful keening remained, louder than ever. Though she knew not why, Yaotl felt the noise must be born of a sullen and ancient sorrow which words could never do justice. She nearly questioned Yanande, but the chieftain before her was, as ever, stony and unmoved, and she held her tongue. Better to let Yanande believe Yaotl to be as fearless as she. Yaotl was, as she had said, the representative of Shulasha'idi. She did her best to act the part. Yet her grip about the stock of her rifle tensed with each jolt in the saddle, and her ears were kept honed on the ruins, scouring for any break in that windless wail. It was as they drew up into the shadows at the very base of the mountains that Yanande pulled her Niena to a halt and slipped with effortless ease to the ground. She tethered it to a sturdy acacia, motioning for Yaotl to do the same. "The beasts do not trust the place," the Boag explained. "My sister will have done the same. We go in on foot." Yaotl left her horse a good distance from the Niena. Even if the pair were both petrified, The Niena still eyed the spooked equine with all the lust of a famished wolf, and Yaotl had no wish to ride back to the others sharing a saddle with Yanande. Carrying an electric lantern, she fell into step beside her Khandari guide, winding through the scattered boulder fields and gnarled trees, painfully aware of just how towering the grass was, and how vulnerable she felt in its blinding clutch. Before long, they had rounded a knoll of stone and come into a narrow valley, overlooked by balconies and murder holes from which defenders might once have loosed arrows on the unwelcome newcomers. Now they passed by unmolested, and upon reaching the dour gatehouse at the end of the overgrown road, they found it standing open, the grass of the plains outside having eaten its way into the shaded packed dirt of the causeway beyond. Within those doors, the sparse light of the moon was eaten away, and the cave-like labyrinth Yaotl's mind painted beyond that curtain of night positively vibrated with the keening cry which haunted the valley. Yanande halted before the entrance. The Boag gestured to fresh prints in the dusty earth before them, nodding to herself. Their quarry was within. She then turned to face her companion head-on for the first time since they'd left their followers in the hills, leaning casually on the broad haft of her assegai. In the gloom, Yanande could just make out the glint of her jagged, yellowed grin. Yaotl was reminded again just how large the looming Khandari was. She came only to the chieftain's midriff. The lord of Clan Tallata must be more than 7 feet tall, a sinewy and lean predator built for scanning the surface of Khandar's sweeping savannah above endless windswept grass. The hunch of Yanande's hyena-like neck made it seem as if the warrior were leaning over her, jeering, but her voice was calm and cool, far less hostile than before. "I have only braved Khalquayam a few times, Shaishan," Yanande admitted. "I fear nothing, but it is dangerous. You would do well to stick close. There are many unsavory things which lurk in the dark. I think my sister will be the least of our worries." With that, Yanande produced a torch of dried cattle dung wrapped in oiled cloth from the saddlebag she carried slung over one shoulder. She brought out a sparking lighter, a factory-made Shaishan lighter, Yaotl realized, and put flame to the thing before turning back to her witness. "Keep your light off. The locals do not like the cold of electric lights." With that strange proclamation made, Yanande pushed through the doorway into the darkness, Asagai's spear in one hand and torch held high in the other, Yaotl following close behind. The canine obeyed, keeping her lantern at her belt and her rifle at the ready. The pair found themselves in a broad passage which fast opened up onto an avenue of large, utilitarian, stately buildings. They were carved into the stone all about them, and their motifs were elegant and curving, with soft-edged cones and semicircles being common patterns along the walls. The complexity of their design was almost arcane, but the strident advance of ages had seen them caked with the grit of grime and refuse as birds and bats and mice nested among the nooks and crannies in the dark. Drooping fronds of lichen and moss which would bake in the full light of the scorching sun outside thrived there, so thick in places that they mired windows and walkways. The building interiors sprawled back into the mountains, their lattice-work wooden windows and engraved doors having been left ajar in the dusty cavern air. Every now and again, Yaotl glimpsed glints and flares through those apertures as unseen surfaces in the gloom caught the flame of Yanande's torch. These reflections were always fleeting, for the Khandari's purposeful stride was long, and Yaotl had to focus to keep pace with her. The fact that she could not tell what was back there in the shadow only made her more cautious, and she kept the butt of her weapon shouldered and her finger upon the trigger as they slunk through passages like silent thieves, any hint of their going muffled by the ever louder shrieks which echoed down the mighty tunnels and byways of Khalquayam. Yaotl's nerves were at their most frayed when they rounded a sharp bend in the main causeway and came upon a gigantic courtyard clad in midnight's glow. The mountain overhead was torn through by a chasm, and beneath the winking starlight pouring in from the sky above was revealed an open-air market of rotten stalls and vacant storefronts. The mounded silks and tokens of Khalquayam's folk were still here, unmolested by raider or looter. They served now only as warrens for rodents and insects, which skittered from the torchlight as they came onto the cobbled floor of the courtyard, still tracing the faint footprints of a recent intruder through the dust. The place was unbelievably loud, for the baleful keening of Khalquayam played up the walls of the chasm like music through an opera house. Yaotl's eyes were accosted by the gleaming flares of metalcraft, weaponry and jewels, perhaps, through the dark. It was only when Yanande stopped beside one of these mounds of metal and casually tapped it with a booted foot that Yaotl realized its outline was awfully familiar. "They are a boisterous bunch," Yanande chuckled, her voice raised to be heard above the din. "As irksome in death as they were in life." For the first time, Yanande cast her flickering flame down to fully illuminate the mound she'd kicked. And it was no mound. It was the kneeling form of a Khandari, a male it seemed, for Yaotl could see it was significantly smaller than Yanande. Its shape was cast in a lunar silver which dazzled her eyes after so long in the tunnels. It seemed to be a statue of flawless metal, but Yaotl knew in that moment that it was no statue, however motionless it might be. Its colorless eyes were wide, its limbs frozen in frenzied agony, its glittering mouth open in a still, endless shriek. Her eyes bounced from the form before them to the countless other glinting shapes bent prostrate across the market square, some of gold, some of copper, all vile mockeries of the city which had become their tomb. "Our people have done similar things," Yaotl murmured, eyes wide in the weak moonlight which struggled down from above. "Our fathers wove monstrosities of flesh from the defeat of our old masters. I've never seen such things in person, though. Totems and effigies to vengeance. It was not because of their wealth or lordship our mothers bound them in metal and set their lungs aflame," Yanande snapped. It was a harsh sound, and she glanced around as if expecting to be overheard. When at last the Khandari continued, it was in a more guarded tone, leaning close to Yaotl that she might be heard. "It was weakness. They grew soft in Khalquayam, rich and placid. Khandarag does not abide fragile daughters. Thus, they were made an example of, that no clan ever again dabble with the urban stone and glimmering coin of settled life." Khandarag, she knew the name well, the bloody-handed lunar goddess of the savannah. Khandarag had long been held by the Sholashaishan Inquisition to be a female aspect of the Empire's own war god Harakwe, a tenet of faith which had been adopted when the lands of Khandar had been incorporated into the Empire as vassals. The Khandari clans paid homage to that belief atop temples back home in Tepeklan each solstice, using blood to seal the union of their peoples. But this new sight, these tortured revenants of Khalquayam, seemed troublesome to Yaotl. Yaotl drank Yanande's words in, silent. She milled the Boag's testimony over a moment, eyes still boring into her reflection in the silver which danced in starlight before her, more foreign in those scant seconds than she'd ever been in vast and unwelcoming Khandar. "It seems an unjust thing," Yaotl said finally, "to imprison for so long a people against whom you have no quarrel." "That is where your Harakwe and my Khandarag differ, little dog," said Yanande. "There is no justice on the open plain. That is a luxury of cottages and streets and farmsteads. Khandarag knows only struggle." Yanande kicked the silver figure once more, softer this time. They ceased the struggle. Their lives lost meaning. Now, their struggle is everlasting. Yaotl, still honed in on the screeching metal wraith, was waved to her senses by a thump from Yanande's outstretched finger. The Khandari had flicked her. It was an almost childish gesture, but there in the bowels of Khalquayam it jolted her like a punch. The Khandari didn't acknowledge her flinch, however, nor did she mock her foreign witness. She merely motioned Yaotl back to the trail of winding prints through the dust they'd followed in. "They cannot harm us," Yanande assured her. "Their pain is their own. It is the other residents of the halls we must avoid." As if to accentuate her point, a large and slinking shape darted forth from the far wall of the courtyard towards them, a blur to Yaotl's vision, scuttling between prostrate metal screamers and across weather-gnawed stone. It was a scant outline glimpsed across the vast market at first, but so quick was its motion that it soon came into vague focus. Splayed claws, glistening chitinous limbs, a mighty arched stinger poised like a striking viper above its back. A Khandar scorpion, young among its kind, perhaps only as heavy as a hardy plow horse. Despite its weight, it seemed to glide upon its many limbs, silent as rolling mist, its coming a thing of dreadful quiet amidst the clamor of the shrieking market. It was then, with the very shadow of death closing in, that Yaotl felt keenly her youth and lack of experience. Never had she fired her rifle outside the halls of the academies before. Would it prove useless? Before Yaotl could so much as level her gun or show anything more than fumbling animal panic at the appearance of the hunting arachnid, Yanande was before her, thrusting her torch like a lance towards the beast. The oily flames spewed smoke in gusts which wafted like a low-hanging wall, and at their taste, the slow-witted giant which had lunged for them hesitated. Yanande, showing a collected precision long practice had forged, leapt through the smoke with the flame held high. So close was she in that moment that the scorpion could have impaled her upon its tail, or snatched her up in its crushing claws. Yaotl expected it, almost flinched away in anticipation of the mortal blow, but such a blow did not come. Dazzled by the light and the acrid fumes, the awful thing wheeled about on its vile legs and fled for the deep dark of the open storefronts, from whence it came. Mute as it had been on the charge, it faded softly back into vast silhouette as it came to the far wall. Its gigantic form slid effortlessly up the sheer rock of the chasm above them, before diving into the open balcony of an overhanging shop set into the cliff face. Yaotl looked on Yanande with wide eyes as the Boag turned back to face her. "It is best not to linger in one place for long," Yanande advised, hoisting her torch again. "Let's move. Stay clear of any sewer grates, walls, or doorways. Keep your eyes moving, always. You will not hear an attacker before it makes its move." Yaotl believed it. To hear anything over the ceaseless wail of Khalquayam was a struggle, and the things which shared the darkness with them moved with a swift silence born of necessity. As the unlikely duo wound off out of the market into the tunnel causeways once more, pursuing the familiar booted tracks, they disturbed a small troop of reddish apes strung along one wall, who scurried up to safety amidst the elegant masonry hanging down from above. A tangle of juvenile snakes huddled for warmth against a storefront scattered when the light of the torch reached them. Bats rustled the air above their heads as they hunted in the near blackness. All these beings came and went with a hush made all the more profound by the riotous screaming which reverberated and thundered through the halls. But it was the scorpions who were most silent, for each time a mighty clawed limb twitched at the edge of their light in a derelict doorway, or a shining black carapace glinted in the crevices of masterful statuary upon the walls, no scratching or pattering announced the motion. They were lethargic things, grown fat and slow on the creatures which came in to hide from the lion and hyena of the sprawling savannah. Their thin, sensitive hairs detected the slightest wriggling in the dark, and a monkey or wild dog haunting the halls needed only make one wrong move to be snapped up and whisked away into the bowels of an old Khalquayam house-turned-burrow, their cries lost to the soaring, cruel music of the dead city. The kingly vermin left eggs mounded in secluded corners which the monitor lizards and serpents stalking the grounds dared not trouble, for the crags and angles of ancient stonework had become nurseries for their young. For thousands of generations, scorpions had poured from the ruins into the surrounding grasslands, returning only when they had grown large and powerful enough to vie for space with their elders in the everlasting gloom. Yanande told stories of scorpion hunts in the open plains which Yaotl could hardly hear as they walked, and speculated that almost every arachnid in her territory had been bred in these halls. The Sholashaishan, for her part, did her damnedest to keep her mind solely upon the faint tracks they followed, to grip tightly the purpose of their presence in Khalquayam, lest she lose her nerve. It was with some relief that they bustled out through a tall gate onto a winding walkway carved into the mountainside, open to the soft breeze of the savannah and the low glow of the oceanic sky. Here, the wind-swept stone was too clean for prints, but there was only one route to follow. Their path was flanked on one side by an ornate balustrade barring a sheer drop to the valley floor below. On the other, steep tiers of balconied housing hoven from the mountain stone glared down at them. They boasted stately views of the vista beyond, their windows and entrances becoming blackened eyes in the dark. Occasionally, one of the ancient owners, petrified in precious metal, was visible upon the parapets, arms upraised or thrust outward in frightened pleading with a heaven which would never answer. "She will be nearby, I think," Yanande said, motioning forward along the trail with her spear. Her voice carried better here, for the keening gale of screaming Khalquayam could not batter about the confined halls and chambers out in the open. "You know this place, don't you?" Yaotl asked the question as a diplomatic courtesy, but nothing more. The shaken expression upon Yanande's unshakable features told her all she needed to know. Still, it took the Khandari a long time to answer, and when at last she did, she avoided answering the question directly. "My sister used to creep up here to the great porch when we were both cubs," Yanande explained. "She has long had a fascination with the old ways. She has always lived on the edge of our clan, spiteful of it, yet desiring it all the same. She has never been strong, but she has ever been cunning. That is why the witchery of ancient days tempts her so." Yanande's voice trailed off as they rounded a bend in the walkway and came upon a massive amphitheater which sprawled down into the mountain. The walkway they traversed was its zenith, and the striking construction of it ensured the sounds of the stage far below would reverberate up to the highest tier. The music of this place must once have drifted miles over the open steppe upon the wind. Now its seats were sullied with the gilded figures frozen in agony, and its only music was the awful lamentation of their imprisonment. "Quiet," Yanande ordered, keeping her voice as low as the symphonic screaming permitted. She motioned Yaotl toward a section of balustrade along the outer walkway, urging, "Stay still in the shadow, do not make a sound, and be ready with your gun." The Boag of Clan Tallata tossed her torch to the stone and stood tall, descending the first few rungs of seating to walk among the screamers. Her shield taken from its perch upon her back, she held it out wide and gesticulated with her assegai for an audience Yaotl could not see. "Slink out into the moonlight, Sade," she called to the parapets above and unadorned stage below. "Loose your tricks. Let me taste what poison the shamed daughter of Tallata has brewed up." Yanande's pace quickened, her words echoing ever louder as she drew nearer to the bottom of the amphitheater. "I should have known you would be too weak to stare fate in the eye," the Boag jeered. With a final bound, she leapt down onto the moonlit stage, laughing as she went. The laughter mellowed slightly as another voice rang out above the screams. This one Yaotl could barely decipher, drawn and slow, dripping contempt as a stinger drips venom. It tumbled down from the curved balconies overlooking the amphitheater, though the reverberation made it impossible for the Sholashaishan to pinpoint where the speaker hid up there amidst the stone and statuary. "You remembered my spot," the voice rasped. "Proud Yanande has not wholly forgotten her blood bonds, then. Do you remember our wanderings here, sister? Our searching in the dark?" "You searched," Yanande spat. "I stalked. Even then you were frail, hungry for secrets to find. You ran ahead, eager for old lore, delving tunnels too deadly for even a Boag Bala to tread. I followed only to protect you. How very different things are now." "Not so different," the voice returned. "I still ran ahead, did I not? And again I found something you wouldn't dare put to use." Yaotl's ears twitched, and her skin was pulsed by gooseflesh. A chill had coursed over the arena to mock the dry, warm night. She was certain of it. Yanande confirmed that hunch, for her head cocked beneath her tall helm, and a jittery shiver played itself out at the Khandari's fingertips. Yaotl winced as her companion's spear slipped free to the floor, clanging like a morning bell off the weather-worn stones. "You were always too proud, sister, too devout and bold and bloody-minded. There are other ways to find victory, you know. Other ways to win power and riches. But those are for me to know. I won't keep you around to see them." It was with no small amount of deepening dread that Yaotl realized Yanande could not move. The warrior shuddered and flinched, wriggled and clasped. Still the powerful form of the Boag did not budge, as if she were wrapped taut in the frigid grasp of a mighty specter. "Had you merely stopped to feel the world around you in youth, you would have realized there is much power here," the voice crooned. "You need not be worthy of Khandarag's eye to take it. Indeed, our wrathful goddess left so much in this ancient place that she cannot claim to command it all. It took long to learn to twist it to my will, and even longer to control it. But even a fraction of that power is enough to end you." A shadow moved upon one of the balconies above, slinking forth to lurk behind the carven rail. Crowning that silhouette were two piercing eyes, burning with a green balefire glint like twin sun-scorched emeralds. Scraggly and strained features came into focus, matted fur and graying muzzle upon a bony and bent figure which writhed with the ecstasies of ritual dance in the night. That twisted figure was nude, scarred and malformed, a less noble parody of the barbarian chieftain who stood frozen in the amphitheater below her. "You proclaimed me a witch, Yanande," the figure taunted. "And so I am. Sade, crone of Tallata, mistress of Khalquayam. The fetish I left for you to find was just that, a token, a taunt, a trail for you to sniff out and follow. And you did follow. You trailed me right into the font of my power. So brave, and so foolish." Slowly, with all the silence to which their kind were born, a wave of Khandar scorpions swept from the lower rungs and banisters of the viewing boxes above them. Their dark bodies, glittering in the night's lunar panoply, poured like quick-moving tar around where Sade gesticulated and writhed on the balcony. They made straight for the stage, and the prone Boag Yanande, who waited stock-still upon it. For the second time that night, Yaotl was besieged by the need to move quickly and precisely. Thus far, the witch upon the balcony seemed blind to her, for the Sholoshaishan must be to her a mere shadow upon the far parapet above the amphitheater. It was impossible to know how long that would last after Yaotl broke her observation and made to act, though. Again it petrified her to think her only experience shooting had been on the ranges of the academies, and again she did her best to swallow that fear and steady her trembling hand. She had one chance, and she needed to make it count. She moved, shouldering the rifle. Yaotl, the best shot of all the female auxiliaries who had trained for dispatch to Khandar, took aim for the first time at something which was not a painted target or spinning clay disc. Her motion was fluid, oiled and perfected by the thrum of her heart and the adrenaline spiking her every twitched motion. That motion did not go unnoticed. Sade, arms still raised high, had just enough time to trace the strange movement in the dark, just enough time to croak out a startled cry at the figure she now glimpsed rising beyond the amphitheater. "Foreigner!" Then a crack broke the screeching music of Khalquayam, and the witch lurched with a shiver that had more to do with fright than the force of the bullet that punctured her bony chest. Like a rag doll stood aloft on flimsy fabric legs, she wavered, poised for a moment on the brink before pitching forward over the stone rail and falling the 100 feet and more to the stage below. But she did not strike the rock, Yaotl saw, for one of the witch's arachnid slaves, freed from whatever ensorcelment had bound it to its master, plucked her from the air like a swooping bat in its darting claw as she passed it along the wall. Then more beasts fell upon the first, jostling for the choicest limbs, and sending the catcher scuttling back into the darkened balconies upon the mountainside. The short-lived witch of Khalquayam was dragged, in pieces, back into the shadows which ruled the ruins, never to disturb its agonized denizens again. So absorbed was Yaotl in the spectacle that when Yanande appeared before her, breathless and apparently also loosed from the sorceries of Sade, she lurched in surprise. The towering Yanande did not give her time to react, though, and swept the stunned Sholoshaishan over her shoulder, rifle and all, before clambering out over the railing and sliding with the grace of a circus acrobat down the sheer slope of engraved stone and carven windows which decorated the mountain spire. Behind them, the remainder of the horde Sade had called forth scuttled and surged in hungry pursuit, freed of their bondage, but never freed of their instincts. If the warriors of Clan Tallata had dared lurk close enough to the city to see them from a distance, their flight down the slopes and statuary of the dead city would have seemed to be from a viscous avalanche of unprocessed oil. Yanande was as keen on her feet as she was in the saddle, and she sprinted down near vertical inclines as often as she slid and rolled. Yaotl greatly desired to break free and bear her own weight, but each lurch over a roof's edge or lunge off a weather-worn parapet reminded her that bearing her own weight here meant death. Her only consolation, had she fallen, would have been that the impact should kill her before the steady waves of crawling vermin reached her. She did not fall, though, and after a final sweeping descent of the battered lower walls of Khalquayam, which saw Yanande swing from handhold to handhold in the dark like an ape coming to ground, they crashed together to the grassland dust in the ruin's shadow. Yaotl was tossed unceremoniously to her feet before Yanande burst into motion, her Sholoshaishan charge struggling first to shake off the nausea of the descent, and then to match the pace set by the Khandari's elongated legs. They didn't need to flee far, though, for as their arching retreat took them further from the shadow of the city and around the base of the mountains to where their mounts awaited them, the fat arachnid colossi began to cut their losses and turn back. Only a weak and straggling few pushed on after the trespassers, and even those haggard specimens had turned tail and slid to the shadow by the time Yaotl and Yanande leapt into the saddle and took to the grass once more. It was only when they'd begun to climb back out of the valley that Yaotl, still winded, demanded, "How was it your sister was taken unaware back there? Why make such a reckless gamble for one shunned outcast?" "It was hubris that made her assume I was alone when she saw me upon the stage," Yanande answered, her eyes remaining locked upon the moon as it sank beyond the far horizon. "But we made no gamble. Even if she had spotted you, she could have done you no harm, little dog." Yanande grinned, though her attention was still elsewhere. The old magics of Khalquayam were woven with Khandarag's scorn against Khandari blood. "You are a foreigner who arrived after Sade had fled, no less. This is the reason I chose you, Shaishin. Even if you had been spotted before she would have been powerless to do anything save sick her pets upon you. Scorpions might be fast, but bullets are faster. Why hide me at all, then?" "It was funnier that way, no?" Yanande grinned, finally tossing a glance back towards Yaotl upon her jumpy horse. "Sade brought low in the middle of her triumph, and by a Sholo Shaishan woman, no less. Your kindred doesn't even allow you weapons. Such a death is only a tiny step above being ended by a Rahogo." Yaotl considered every manner of retort, from shaming the Khandari female's lack of learning to debating the merits of mothers who fought in the saddle. For surely Yanande, lord of her clan and well into adulthood, had borne many children. But she held her tongue. She had one goal in Khandar, she reminded herself, and it was not to civilize the Khandari. "Still, it was a fine shot," Yanande said, her words more surprised than complimentary. "You have fought before, yes?" "Often," Yaotl lied. If she detected dishonesty, Yanande did not let on. Rather, she nodded, her eyes still upon the small crest of moon visible over the hills, paling by the minute as dawn crept nearer and bathed the savannah in the pinks and reds of a nascent sunrise. Birds were awakening to sing, and burrowing mammals chittered out their calls to action from distant mounds. As these sounds crept in on her astride the returned winds of the rolling grassland, Yaotl realized she could no longer hear the screaming din of distant Khalquayam. "I look forward to seeing more of it in the coming war, Yaotl of the Ektal."